Hi, everybody. This is Professor Alex, and today I will be going over Chapter 1, which is just Intro to Sociology, and I'll be following the slides from the Sociology 3E textbook, which you can find on OpenStax for free. So I wanted to just go through Chapter 1 really quickly as an overview, and cover, ideally the most important information in this chapter. So again, chapter 1, Intro to Sociology. So if you're here for the first time, welcome to sociology. As I've kind of said in class, sociology is the study of society or the study of social groups. You're always looking at groups of people rather than the individual. So to start off, let's pop in here. Let's see what's up. So of course, society, right? Society is a group of people who lived in some defined geographic area, who interact with each other and share a common culture. This can be anything from like DC society or like the society in Prince George community, or that could be the DMV, or that could be the United States. You can go from anywhere from a small community to a large community. Any of these things are defined as society as long as there is a common culture, understanding, values, and whatnot. Sociological imagination is what I want to encourage you to use during class in terms of it's kind of this idea of having a blank slate, having your mind open, being willing to hearing different perspectives and ideas, and yeah, being able to think about them sociologically and kind of removing any sort of bias or assumptions that you have about different cultures or practices. When we get into, yeah, so then there's quantitative and qualitative sociology. These are the kind of main subsets within sociology in terms of how you want to study and do research, right? So quantitative sociology, if you think about the prefix of quant or quantitative, we're talking about numbers. So quantitative sociology is going to be anything that kind of has statistics, numbers, even sort of math, charts, graphs, anything that can show us numerical trends. And so if you're a quantitative sociologist, if you're doing research, you're more likely to create a survey and send that out to people. And that's where you kind of have like a Likert scale, which is what we call a kind of a scale where it might go from strongly disagree to strongly agree, or anything from maybe a scale from 1 to 5 or a scale from 1 to 10. And again, that's numerical, right? Even if someone strongly disagrees, we might associate that with the number 1. And if someone strongly agrees, we might associate that with the number 10. And we can still do a numerical quantitative study based on translating those scales into numbers. So if you're a quantitative sociologist, you're probably sending out surveys. And the benefit of this is that it's cheap and it's easy to reach a lot of people. You can have a much higher sample size if you do quantitative sociology. On the other hand, we have qualitative sociology. This is anything like interviews, participant observation, ethnographies, focus groups, anything like that, or even looking at collections of books, magazines, artwork, anything that's you can think of it as anything that's not numerical, right? Anything that's more so perspective or experience focused. And so a lot of sociologists go into sociology because they want to be able to do these interviews about kind of like more niche subjects, and they want to be able to actually ask people about their experiences, etc. My personal opinion is that the future of sociological research and the more quality sociological research combines quantitative and qualitative sociology. So for me, if it's a really good study, I'm looking at something that has interviews and then something numerical to back up those interviews, right? So yeah, I love to see interviews because as a sociologist, we absolutely believe that your lived experience is valid, right? Can you generalize off of your lived experience? No. And that's where we bring in the numbers to see, is this a trend? Is this a pattern that we see in society? The problem with qualitative sociology is it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's incredibly hard to get the go ahead, right? If you want to do research, you have to do an IRB application, which is where the IRB is the Institutional Review Board. And before you do any research, you need to submit an application to the IRB. If you're doing a survey, it's a much quicker process where they're just like, sure, okay. But with qualitative sociology, there's a big consideration of harm, like what kind of harm might happen. An example I have from grad school is I had a colleague who wanted to do interviews on people who have experienced police brutality. Our professor said, no, you need to have a PhD for that. And that's particularly because if you don't have the experience or the degree, you can't work with vulnerable populations, right? You can't be interviewing children, you can't be interviewing inmates, you can't be interviewing anyone who, if you're looking at like police brutality, like you're bringing up something traumatic, right? And if you are going to interview about something traumatic or sensitive, you have to be able to provide like a debrief. You should be able to provide therapy or other other resources that might help them get through that, right? Like you can't just interview someone on something traumatic and then be like, okay, great, thanks. It's unethical, right? So it can be harder to get approved for a qualitative study if it has to do with a vulnerable population, right? You need to have the qualifications, the credentials, and you have to do a very intense kind of process where you explain exactly what you're going to ask and why that's beneficial to your study, because otherwise they'll be like, if this question isn't beneficial to the study, cut it out. So whatever. My thing is, I think a combination of quantitative and qualitative is good so that we can have on the quantitative side numbers and trends and statistics, and on the qualitative side we can get people's actual lived experiences and opinions and perspectives. They're both important, they're both valid, but they work better when you can combine them. So then we're going to move into a few major theorists in sociology. Because this isn't a theory class, you will not be tested on any of these theorists, but I'm going to give you a kind of quick recap, but not too deep. So we have Auguste Comte, and he is known for positivism, which is the scientific study of social patterns. And here, the most important thing is that positivism assumes that society has scientific laws and principles, and that scientific evidence is the best way to understand society and what's going on within that. The opposite of positivism is interpretivism. I can't say that. It's fine. Let it go. So interpretivism is based on the assumption that reality is subjective, that there's multiple perspectives, and that it's socially constructed. So the difference is really, focusing on, hard facts versus also understanding that people's lived experiences are valid and worth study and worth the time, right? And it's like something, I don't really have an opinion here. It depends on your perspective, but I would think it should be kind of a mix of both, where yes, on one hand, we should be able to study this scientifically, but on the other hand, we should also be able to understand that reality is, subjective. There's a lot of different perspectives, and, a person can go through, you and your friend could go through the same scenario, the same experience, but the way that you understand that and react to that could be completely different. And that's okay, right? Again, as sociologists, we largely do believe that lived experience is valid, and it's a valid and important part of research. And kind of going into that more, I think that one of the special things about sociology is that we can really capture a moment, right? So let's talk about COVID, right? So during COVID, sociologists did a really great job of doing interviews during COVID, as people are going through COVID, so that in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, not only can we go back and look at the numbers, but we can actually have an account of how people felt during that time. And so, you can't necessarily make generalizations off of interviews, but it's a historical thing where, again, in 100 years, they'll be able to look back and be like, here are interviews from people during COVID and how they felt going through that at the time. So also valid, right? Maybe not generalizable, but valid. If you go into Harriet Martineau, oh, I love her. She's kind of a bad beat, you know what I mean? And she, essentially what she did was, I mean, a lot of things, but what's impressive to me is she's from the UK and she came to the US to do observations and studies. And this is kind of important because she's not from the US. So she kind of came in, not to say unbiased, but without kind of being ingrained into the society and our values and traditions and practices. And this is important because When she came to the US, not we, but people in the US were hanging, lynching, torturing people, Black people particularly, right? And she came over and she put it on blast. She was like, because we were in the US, we were being kind of quiet about it. We weren't bragging about this. We were just kind of doing it. And you got to think, like, people were doing lynchings for, like, everyone in the community would come, like, entertainment or something. And it's interesting because in that context, it was normalized. Those people probably didn't think, oh, this is so weird or so messed up. They were probably just like, yeah, this is what we do for fun. Hard for me to imagine, but I understand. And so essentially, Harriet came over and she was like, these people are hanging people for fun and for entertainment. And she put us on blast because we were kind of low key about that. And she came in and was like, y'all treat not only Blacks horrible, but like women as well. And so she pretty much came and did an expose on the US, which kind of finally made it open to the world about what we were doing to Black people and to women. So she kind of came in and did an expose, and she kind of called out people in the US and our racism and our sexism. And I was like, for me, I'm like, mad respect. I love that. That's cool. Karl Marx, I think I told y'all I'm a bit biased because I was trained as a conflict theorist. So I do love me some Marx, but so I'm like, I need to not get too deep into this. But so essentially, Karl Marx, conflict theory, right? So he looks at conflict, primarily class conflict. He believes that class conflict is the basis of all other conflict, right? Trying to think about how to explain that easily. But yeah, essentially he's looking at class conflict and kind of like social class and how they conflict, and pretty much looking at how, you know, social change comes through social conflict. And this is important, right? He's like, any sort of change is because there was a conflict. And so I kind of made this up, but I think this works really well. I've been using this in class for a few years now, is that conflict leads to conversation or communication. I like the alliteration of the CCC, right? But conflict leads to communication, which leads to change, right? You have to have some sort of conflict to bring attention to a certain conversation, and having that conversation will bring change. And yeah, we see this a lot throughout history. Take it as you want. He also wrote the Communist Manifesto. I'm not going to talk too much about that. All I'll say is that there's kind of a misconception that he is pushing for a specific type of communism, but really the thing with Marx is he's critiquing capitalism. He does not at any point have any suggestion about how to do communism. It's more so a critique of capitalism, and he's pushing for certain things like the reallocation of goods, or essentially like evening out class levels. And he believes that if we were to make classes more equal, then everything else would kind of fall into place. So with the Communist Manifesto, he's not really writing about how we should do communism. And the other thing is he's not suggesting we do communism like any other country has done communism. When we think about communism, we think about certain countries and how that's not gone well. For him, it was kind of more so this like idea of what we could do with communism, and not to copy anybody else, but to come up with our own form of communism that would be beneficial for the society. Doesn't detail how to do that, but he mostly, the book, the main point is to critique capitalism and show that capitalism is not working. So going off of that, there's a few words that you need to know. So first of all, the basis that you'll hear a lot is the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. You all know the word bourgeoisie because we know the song Bad and Bougie. We've been using the word bougie. Bougie refers to bourgeoisie, which is Karl Marx's term, right? So he has in his head, in his writing, there's two classes. There's a proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is, sometimes people will say, oh, the 1%. I don't even think the bourgeoisie is 1%. I think the bourgeoisie is the 0.01%, the millionaire billionaires, right? Like those people at the very, very, very top. Everybody else is the proletariat. And when we think about proletariat, we think working class, anybody who's in working class. And so we have to think, even doctors are working class, right? There's a lot of people who make a lot of money, but they're working class. When I talk about the bourgeois, I'm talking about the multimillionaires and the billionaires, right? I would say even doctors, the people that we think of having high prestige, even they are working class or they are proletariat. And so he kind of uses this term called wage labor. Most proletarians are under wage labor, and that means any employee who sells their physical labor and time for either a wage or a salary. So again, bourgeoisie are like the ultra rich, proletariat are the working class, and the proletariat do wage labor. They sell their own time and energy for a wage or for a salary. And then to kind of go into bourgeoisie a little bit more, so again, the ultra rich, but one of the terms that we use in sociology to kind of explain this a little bit deeper is the bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production. The owners of the means of production. What that means is that the bourgeoisie, they own the facilities and resources needed for producing goods. So this means that think about working in a factory, or even, let's even say working as a doctor, right? When the doctor goes into work, they don't own the hospital. They don't own the resources that they're using. They don't own the MRI machines. They don't own any part of it. They come in and they're selling their time and their labor. So that's why I'm saying even like, more prestigious jobs, it's still, unless you own the hospital, you're a wage laborer, you're a proletariat. Another good example of this might be, you can be a NFL player or an NBA player and you can make a lot of money, right? But you don't own the court. You don't own most of it. So you can think about like a basketball player being a wage laborer or a proletariat, working class, they're selling their time and energy, whereas maybe the person who actually owns the whole team would be the bourgeois. They own the whole facility and when you can use it and how you can use it and all the resources within that facility. So that can be a little bit confusing, but it is important. If you are bourgeois, it means that you own the means of production. People are coming to work for you. They're using your facilities and your resources. I digress. Now we have Herbert Spencer. He's known for social Darwinism. And if you know what Darwinism, it's kind of one of those like survival of the fittest type things. And he essentially takes Darwinism and applies it to people in society, right? And so he pretty much says that, like the struggle is intrinsic, right? He's like, due to Darwinism, right, which is survival of the fittest, he's like, well, same thing with people where the strong will be more powerful and more wealthy than those who are not, right? And so it's hard. I haven't read a bunch of Spencer, so I can't really get too deep into this. But if if you're a social Darwinist, you're saying that, the stronger and the more powerful will make money and the rest will not. And this can be used to justify things like imperialism, colonization, racism, classism, sexism, eugenics, and social inequality in general. Might have to read more into this, but off the bat, I'm kind of like, probably not my theorist. You can look more into it if you're curious. The concept of social Darwinism is interesting. I just don't know that I'm into it, but make your own perspective. Durkheim, he looks at kind of the objective social facts. He looks at how social ties lead to solidarity. And his major contribution to sociology is that he actually was one of the first people to really say that, oh, sociology is its own field, right? Sociology is deserving of its own kind of title and method of study. And as I said, sociology is a mix of philosophy, anthropology, criminology, economics, poli-sci, history, right? But Durkheim kind of came in and was like, yeah, it includes all of these things, but sociology is worthy of its own field of study. So I'll give him props for that, but he also did suicide, which I'll talk about more in class. He talks about like these four main types of suicide, and it's not what you would think. I'm not going to get into it now, but if you want to go YouTube Durkheim's suicide, it's pretty interesting. Not super relevant for this class, but an interesting take. Herbert Mead, he focuses on the self. Like he's looking at the looking glass self. How do we perceive ourselves? How do we perceive ourselves in terms of certain contexts? How do we portray ourselves in certain contexts? I even think about how we're to do Deviance Day. That would be taking in a lot of kind of Herbert Mead's ideologies and ideas about how context is important and how our perception of ourselves and others is important and kind of guides how we act and behave in different social settings. So I would say his main contribution to society is kind of this idea that our self arises from the process of social interaction and through communication with others. We'll get into this later, but there's technically four main agents called main agents of socialization. And the four main agents of socialization, first and foremost, family, second, friends and peers, also school, and then the last thing is media, whether it's social media, movies, TVs, news, whatever. So he's pretty much saying that through these agents of socialization, and socialization is just the way that we learn to behave and react and to think in society based on these influences, right? So the way that we learn to behave and act in society is based off of family, friends, school, media. Those are the main ones. So Herbert Mead is pretty much talking about the development of the self. How do we come to the understanding of who we are, and also at the same time understanding that who we are is based on the context and the environment that we're in. We can talk more about this in class, but essentially just he looks at the development of the self or self ideology and what influences or what kind of environmental and contextual elements influence our perception of self and how we behave in society. We will talk about the main three theories: conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and structural functionalism. So to rewind really quickly, Marx is a conflict theorist. Conflict theory is also known as Marxism, and it's also known as historical dialectical materialism, but that's a mouthful, so we just go with conflict theory. But Marx is the inception of conflict theory. And on the other hand, George Herbert Mead is kind of the inception of symbolic interactionism. When we think about symbolic interactionism, don't overthink it. It's literally the symbolism within our interactions. When we interact with people, when we talk to people, the things that we wear, all of these things are symbolic. Like, for example, I don't have any rings on right now, but if I were to wear a ring on this finger, you don't even need to talk to me. You can assume that I'm married. And in and of itself, it's just metal or diamond or rock, and we've formed that metal and that rock in a certain form. And then when you put that certain form onto a certain finger, it means something. That's symbolism. In and of itself, it's just metal and a rock, right? But when we form it in a certain way and we wear it on a certain hand, on a certain finger, all of a sudden it means something. It means that you're married, right? And so symbolic interactionism looks at that, like what kind of symbols do we use to interact, right? For example, and when I think about symbolic interactionism, I do want to say that they consider symbols, when you think about the alphabet, right? When you think about the alphabet, they're like, that is symbols put together in a way to help us communicate. So language, the basis of it is symbols, or putting together symbols to make meaning. But another thing is that, so it can be verbal, but it can also be nonverbal. So for example, if you come to class and you're wearing, I don't know, your favorite anime character on your shirt, you don't even need to say anything. Someone else might look at you and be like, oh, they like anime. Maybe we have something in common, right? They might come up to you and be like, oh, like, what was your favorite episode? So symbolism can be verbal, but it can also be nonverbal, like I said, with a ring or whatever you're wearing, the way that you act. All these things can be symbolic. So I do think symbolic interactionism is really cool. This is known as a micro theory, and that means kind of studying interactions in a smaller kind of subset of people and looking at how people in the same environment and context interact and what kind of symbolism do we use for that. So he's a symbolic interactionist. Weber, what I can tell you is, if you want to sound smart, it's Max Weber, spelled Weber, but it's Weber, like if you were to say it with a V. So he, I don't know, I don't really care for him too much, but we can get more into some of these other things in class. But the main point that he has is that human beings adapt their actions according to social context and how these actions affect the behaviors of others. So again, also kind of symbolic interactionist, right? Where he's looking at how do our behaviors and the way that we portray ourselves and the way that we communicate, how does that impact others? And then how do others impact the way that we portray ourselves? And again, just really paying a lot of attention to the context and the environment. Du Bois, love Du Bois, right? He is a sociologist. I don't want to make any wrong claims, but he's one of the first Black sociologists. And I would say he's like the major first Black sociologist, right? And I have a bunch of books on him if you want. There's honestly a lot of controversy around him. I think it's worthy of bringing up because essentially earlier in his career, he said some kind of controversial stuff. And I'll use an example. So he had this book called The Talented 10th, where essentially he's talking about how there is a talented 10th of Black people who can excel or move up or do whatever. And he had that kind of idea. He published, I wouldn't even really call it a book, more so like a short manuscript. If you want a copy of it, I got you. But he kind of has these ideas about, you know, like maybe only a 10th of the Black community can excel to whatever level. But him, as well as like Martin Luther King, as they got older, they developed their perspective and they learned more, they were educated more, they talked to more people. And I think this is a good example because even me, like when I first started teaching, there are some things that now that I've read more, I'm like, ooh, I wouldn't say that now, or I don't believe that now. And I think that's really important to note the fact that humans continuously develop and learn and improve. And the more that we read and the more that we talk to people, the more developed our perspective is and the more educated our perspective is. So as with anybody who publishes a lot or who is really influential, as they get older, their perspective develops. And that happened with Du Bois. So yes, some of his earlier work is a bit controversial, but he kind of made up for it during the end. One of my favorite things about Du Bois, because I love statistics, Du Bois went across country, not across country. He went to another, I don't know if he went to Europe. I forget where he went, but he went there for like grad school or whatever. And he was the first person to bring statistics to the US. That's insane. And there's a book about him that I have that's called The Scholar Denied. And what they mean by that title is he was very scholarly. He brought a lot of different educational new aspects to the US, but he wasn't given credit. So I want to give him his flowers and give him credit for bringing statistics to the US. And this is absolutely insane to me because when I do statistics, I have programming. I have a computer. You can go into Word and you can make a graph, you can make a chart. But back in his time, he came back, he had people doing these by hand. By hand. Like, I'm trying to zoom in. Like, imagine trying to do, like, all of this is by hand, like using a protractor. Like, I don't even know. Wait, let me see if I can. Yeah. So like, imagine having to make a pie chart, like by hand though. Like, you using, what do you use? Like a protractor? I don't know, like actually having to measure out 28%, 62% by hand. And again, we can just do that today easily through any sort of Microsoft Excel or Word or SPSS or anything, right? Like, we just put in the information and it comes up. But oh my gosh, back in the day, they did this stuff by hand. And Du Bois was the first person to really get into this and teach this in the US. So I want to give him props for that because no one ever does. And I think it's so impressive. But that's enough about some of the theorists. Again, like I said, our main three paradigms or theories that we'll be using in this class is structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And again, your homework is and has been to look at each of these theories on YouTube because again, I was trained as a conflict theorist. I love symbolic interactionism, but I will say I am biased against structural functionalism, and that's why I want you to look it up and make sure you get the perspective of a structural functionalist before we kind of get into it in class. So I'll wait for that kind of discussion. I do think that this can be sort of a helpful chart. Again, you have access to this slideshow on Canvas, but you can see, for example, structural functionalism. The focus is the way that each part in society functions together to contribute to the functioning of the whole, essentially how they think about how we think about this, pretty much what they say is like, oh, the same way that you need every, organ in your body to work together to be a functioning human, structural functionalists believe that every structure in society has a function. It's really easy to remember these theories if you just almost say them slowly. Structural functionalism is literally that every structure in society has a function. And it expands to the fact that they believe that if the structure exists in society, therefore it has a function and is needed to keep society running smoothly. I have a lot of issues with this, but we will talk about it more in class. I'm sure there are some valid arguments here, but I will say that it's not common that sociologists are structural functionalists anymore. I personally don't know any sociologists who are structural functionalists anymore. But again, I'm giving you my bias at this point, so let me stop. Definitely look into it and get it explained to you by a structural functionalist to decrease the bias that I'm about to teach you. but again, conflict theory, this one's looking at inequality and inequity and how inequality contributes to society in terms of progress and stagnation, right? But looking at conflict and how that impacts and influences society. Symbolic interactionism, like I said, this is a micro theory, which means that we're more so looking at like direct interactions between people in a same room, right? You're not, if you're doing symbolic interactionism, you're not really looking at, oh, comparing people in California and people in DC. You're looking at how people in our classroom interact. Like when we're in a closed setting with each other, how do we use symbolism to interact? So, I mean, that's always valid. It's not really saying anything crazy. It's just looking at the symbolism within our interactions. There's really no claim that goes along with it other than there's a lot of symbolism in our actions and interactions. So definitely look more into these. Like I said, that was your homework. But otherwise, let me wrap this up. This part is a little bit cheesy, but it's what the slides say in terms of why should we study sociology. I would say because it's really interesting. And if you just love people and learning about people, sociology is really cool. Same thing with psychology, right? Like I went into psychology because I was interested in people, but that is the perspective of looking at the individual. Usually with psychology, you're looking at how outer influences and environment and certain stimuli impact the individual. Whereas in sociology, we're more so looking at how those external environments and stimuli and situations impact groups of people, right? So how does certain institutions like the criminal justice system impact certain groups of people negatively or positively more so than other groups, if you know what I'm saying. But let me be clear. How does the criminal justice system discriminate against Black people over white people? How does the criminal justice system privilege white people over Black people or people of color, right? So we're looking at how institutions impact certain groups of people, but it goes the other way as well. How does groups of people and are developing ideologies and beliefs and traditions and practices and values, how does that impact larger institutions in society? So again, with sociology, we're looking at groups of people, how they influence larger structures and institutions, and how those structures and institutions impact social groups. Whereas again, psychology is more so focusing on the individual. It's a bit more biological. You're looking at neurotransmitters, what's going on with the brain, what's going on with your body, how does your health influence your brain, and vice versa, right? So again, just with sociology, think soci, and that means social group or society. So sociology is a study of social groups or society. I digress. So here they're saying sociology is impactful. It is, right? Like I said, like sociologists are able to do these interviews and kind of these niche groups, and it gives us a snapshot of what was happening during this time, right? So that in the future, when people want to kind of look back at what's going on or how people felt during this time, they're not just looking at numbers, but they have actual quotes and stories from people, like actual perspectives and experiences of people during this time. And I'm saying, oh, in the future, looking back, but even now, we can look back at qualitative interviews of people who were going through, I don't know, World War II or the Great Depression or Prohibition or any sort of era in time. A sociologist would help us have access to what were people actually thinking and experiencing during that time beyond numbers, right? And again, numbers help. It's cool when you can combine both of them. That gives us a better picture. Um, Sociology is supportive of careers. I mean, I think that's kind of funny. What I would say is that beyond becoming a sociologist, put that aside, I think that sociology is important and an important aspect for any other career, like especially if you're going into anything medical. Like I know a lot of you are going to the nursing program. So for example, if you are a nurse, you want to be able to incorporate sociology in terms of cultural relativism, right? If you have a patient who's of a different culture, hopefully you can remember from this class, okay, they have another culture. That's not mine. I don't understand it, so I'm going to do some research into it. I'm not going to judge them. I'm not going to compare them to my values and my beliefs, but I'm going to really try to understand their culture and therefore provide a treatment plan that matches their values and needs and desires and beliefs, right? Like, I mean, this is kind of aggressive, but like, isn't it Jehovah's Witnesses that don't allow blood transfers? I could be wrong there, but there's different cultural beliefs, even in terms of medicine and treatment. And so if you are a doctor or a nurse, you want to be wary of the cultural values and beliefs of your patient and incorporate that in your treatment plan. So you can do that in pretty much any field, just kind of incorporating sociological thought and the sociological imagination to make sure that you are providing culturally competent treatment and care to whoever it is that you're working with. I mean, yeah, whatever. They're just saying sociology is cool and important, and I would agree that it's incredibly interesting if you're interested in people, and that, not necessarily that you need to become a sociologist, but I think that any field can incorporate sociology to just kind of, bring you to a point where either, you're focusing on cultural relativism or even focusing on equity, right? And providing equitable care over equal care, equitable care. Make sure to look into that. I mean, you can do equity. I would definitely suggest looking into this. I'll bring this up in class because I always do, right? But looking at the difference between, you can just look up equality versus equity. There's a couple really cute pictures that you can use. And pretty much the big difference between equality and equity is equality is giving everybody the same exact thing. Equality does not take into account that different people need different things, right? Equality is giving every one of these guys a block to stand on, which doesn't take into consideration that this guy's already tall enough to see over the fence. This guy just needs one block to see over the fence, and this guy needs 2 blocks to see over the fence, right? So equality is giving everybody the same exact thing, whereas equity is paying attention to different needs of different people and making appropriate decisions about that. Yeah, so whatever, you can look into that in your own time. And the last thing that this slide says is that sociology helps us understand ourselves. So even if you're not going into some sort of like public health scenario where you're helping other people, I do think that sociology can really push people to be reflective, to think about why you believe what you believe and how we can improve on that. Even like I said in class, like I said, we can't, in class, one of the rules is you can't say, oh, that's so crazy. Just if you're saying, oh, that's so crazy, it's because you don't understand it, right? So we can kind of expand that into understanding ourselves and others and how we interact with others and how we understand others. And not only how we understand others, but how we understand ourselves. So I can get more into that, but I'll do that in class for sure. But so as of now, I will, wrap this up. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail because this is my passion. So of course, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. And again, if you are in my current class right now, you are required to post a comment, whether that is something that you learned or a question that you have, so that when we come to class in our next class session, we can address these questions. So again, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate all of you for being here and paying attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you soon. Bye.